Now that you know how to model objects, you need to know how to give them some materials. And materials are just data blocks that can be assigned to different objects. Now, I realize that doesn't really tell you much, but what's behind materials are something that we call shaders. And shaders describe the lighting interaction at the surface of the objects, particularly their reflection, absorption, and refraction. That is a mouthful, but I don't really think you need to understand those terms to understand materials, at least at first. Now, what's behind materials are something we call nodes, and this is how Blender's material system works. Now, you don't have to use nodes, but if you want to get into the nitty-gritty and be able to actually create interesting materials that aren't just out of the box, then you need to understand the node system. So if you're thinking about materials and objects, and I just have an object here that has a grid on it for education purposes only. So I have different locations on the object, right? Let's take a location, for example, H5. Now, H5, if we're talking about the way materials work, it has a certain material associated with it, right? And that material might have different reflectivity, it might have different absorption, or you could think of it like this. It might look like rubber, it might look like glass, it might look like a metal, and then next to it, G5 is another location, right? And there are different material properties associated with that location, and so on and so forth. So you can think of the material system as assigning material properties to different places on the object. Now, what properties you give it and where that is completely dictated by this node system we have here. Now, how do nodes work? Now, all of these down here are nodes. Certain nodes do different things. There are tons of different nodes, and I'll go through how to make actual materials later, but I just want you to understand how it works. So we have a material output node in almost all cases, or I can't even think of one where you don't have a material output node. All cases have this material output node, and our object is completely black because we are not sending any material or shader information to our object. So I have an node here that's already selected, already put here for us. That's called diffuse. So it's just going to add a diffuse color, and you can see when I left click and drag green to green, now we have what we see as a diffuse gray color, right? So we're giving, the shader gives it information, gives Blender information to let us know to display this object like this. Now let's say that we want to also give it a color. So I could do that here by clicking on this white block, but I'm trying to make a point here, so bear with me. So if I connect my color here in RGB, you can see that it's now green. And I can change that color by moving around here. So we start with a node that says, okay, I want blue. Then we have a node that says, okay, I created diffuse color, but then we have an input here, and you can think of that input as saying, okay, but what color do you want, right? And blue is the color we want. This node says, okay, I'll make a diffuse shader of this color blue that you want and send it to the object. It gets sent to the object, and so it is blue. Now, this is a very simple version of what they call a node tree. Now, let's say that I wanted to convert this color into black and white. Well, I have a node here that I just put here ahead of time that converts RGB to black and white. So I can just left click and drag, I can drop in between. And now you can see that my actual block is black and white. So if I change the color of the entire block, you can see that the shading changes, but it remains black and white. And so you're like, why would I ever want to do that? Well, maybe you wouldn't want to change a solid color to black and white because you can just make it black and white from the beginning. But let's say that you had something like what we had before. Now this is a texture, and textures are just images that we map to our object. In this case, I used this grid just to give you an idea of what we were talking about and how the system works. But anyway, let's say that I don't like this color, right? I'd rather it be black and white. Well, if we drop this RGB to black and white converter in between, you see that now our image is black and white. Now, what you can do to images in Blender, i.e. also textures, what you can do to textures, is infinite. There are tons of mathematical operations and color operations that exist within Blender. I can show you some of them here. These are all of the different nodes that are available within Blender's node material shader system. And you can imagine that you could create a material here with lots and lots of these nodes to do very, very interesting things. And I hope that you will, but that's just to give you an idea of what the node system does and how it works in about 5 minutes. So now that you understand how the materials work, let's talk about how to actually make materials. Now, I'm going to set this up. You don't really need to do this. You can just look at the objects that you already have. But I want you to be able to see what's going on really good. So I'm going to get rid of this block. I'm going to hit Shift A. I'm going to add a sphere, right? And just to make it smooth, I'm going to go into my modifiers panel. I'm going to add a modifier called subdivision surface, and I'm going to crank that up. Now, this just gives the model I'm looking at more subdivisions. And like I said before, this part isn't important. I just want to demonstrate really clearly what's happening in the materials. But this part I do want you to know. So down here we have our timeline, but we're not doing animation. So we're going to get rid of it. So we're going to hover over that, left click, drag it up. We're going to come over here to our menu panel, and we're going to switch to shader editor. Now you could have just clicked here, but that gives you more than what I really want you to see. So we're going to do it that way. So you're looking at the shader editor, and you can see here that it is really nothing's going on, right? And that's because there's no material assigned to it yet. So in your properties section here, we're going to go down to the materials portion, and you can see that nothing is selected. So in order to select the material, all we got to do is either click new or select one of the ones that we already have. But I think it's good for you to know how to make a new one. So you're going to go ahead and click new, and that'll bring up all this information. And I'm just going to call this Mat 2, just to give it a new material, right? And what comes up is what we have here called a principled BSDF. Now I'm going to make that just a little bit bigger, right? And the principled BSDF is capable of making a lot of different materials. So that is the one we're going to focus on here, and you will see why in just a second. So the next thing we're going to do is make sure that we can actually see the material, because we're not in the correct viewport shading mode that allows us to see it. So we're going to go to what's called material preview to see our actual material that we have selected. So we have material preview, we're in material preview mode, and the first thing you need to know about is what's called base color. Now everything is here, and the nodes is also over here, but I really want you to understand the node system. So let's look over here. So all right, so we have the base color system, and you're familiar with this from the last video that I can select my color just like I did before. I can select how dark it is. That's really the important aspect here. So let's go ahead and start with green. Now Blender works on what's called a metalness workflow, which means that all materials are kind of grouped into being metallic or not metallic, or in the technical term dielectric, metallic or dielectric, right? So right now I'm looking at this block and it doesn't look metallic at all. So if I crank this up to 1, you can see that it gives us this kind of brushed metal, dull metal looking color, right? So we can go from it looking like kind of like rubber to it looking like metal by only changing this metallic value. Now let's say that we wanted that metal to be shiny. Well, shininess in Blender, for the most part, you can think of as the amount of roughness. So if we take the roughness all the way down, you can see that we get this mirror finish here, right? And right now it's pretty much almost all the way down. If we crank it all the way up, it gets less and less and less shiny until finally it's completely matte, and we have something that looks a lot more like a potential dielectric, but it's actually still a metal. But if we crack it down, we have something that looks a little bit more like rubber. And if we give it a little bit of sheen and we actually give it a little bit more, we can see that now we have something that looks like plastic. So I can have any color plastic that I want, right? And I can have any color metal that I want. So let's say that I wanted to have gold. Well, gold, I think, is mostly yellow, depending on, how many carats it has. And it's a complete metal. So we're going to bring the metal all the way up. And you can see that we have gold. Now, if we wanted gold with a mirror finish, we could totally do that. We could give it this mirror finish. It doesn't really look like gold as much that way. Or we can, make it kind of hazy, and that gives it another aspect to it. So now you understand how to create a bunch of different colors. And if you want to learn more about Blender, or you want my SpeedKey cheat sheet, or otherwise want to be a part of the EduCraft training team, click the link in the description and let's start training.